Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. Listen to this. Oh, can you hear that? These are the silver Keisers. Oh yeah, 20 silver Keisers. These are now available and being available trading all over the world. That's right, people are joining the Silver Liberation Army, and they are basically financing the global insurrection with these. Yeah, baby! All right, let's bring in Stacy Herbert.
Max Keiser, there's a war on. And in that case, you can never have enough arms as a TV presenter.
Don't try and take my silver Keiser! Don't try and take my silver Keiser!
Here's a little video I want you to see. It gets us in the mood for this broadcast here. It's a Libyan TV presenter.
Oh yeah, let's play that then.
جاهز في أي لحظة.
I'm ready at any time.
As you can see, he's just ranting about protecting the homeland and all this kind of stuff.
He's got a big gun! He's got a big gun! He doesn't have any of these silver Keisers though.
But of course, he's being presented as a man he's pretty crazy. But is it any crazier than the country doing the bombing? Because the headline reads, U.S. spending on military operations in Libya drains Pentagon. The U.S. military operations in Libya will cost hundreds of millions of dollars and force Congress to seek help next week for the cash-strapped Pentagon, which is operating on short-term funding resolution. So remember the financial crisis where the banks were operating on short-term funding as well, and that's what led to the whole collapse of the banking system. Are we about to witness the collapse of the whole military-industrial complex?
I mean, look, their debt ceiling in the U.S. is being raised again. It's at 14.5, 15 trillion. That's doesn't include the wars that they do off the balance sheet, like Super Enron. You know, Afghanistan, Iraq. Where's this new place they're invading? Libya. Okay,
Libya.
That's all off the balance sheet. They don't actually include it on the official balance sheet. So America actually has not just $15 trillion in debt. They've got, well, 45 trillion, and then you add in Fannie Mae, that's 50 trillion, then you add in Social Security and Medicaid, that comes up to about $100 trillion in debt, and they just think that by printing more money, they're going to be able to survive this catastrophe. That's why silver's going to 500.
Well, but they do make a note in this article that none of the war fundings for Afghanistan or Iraq are put on the defense budget. These are all supplemental funding. It's out of temporary short-term funding resolutions. But Carl Levin, a senator from Michigan, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He said Wednesday that he had asked the Defense Department for an accurate estimate of the cost of the mission in Libya, since the ballpark numbers being circulated, including one of nearly $1 billion, seemed too high. So he's only reading in the newspapers what the war is going to cost in Libya. He's the head of the Senate committee where, of course, Barack Obama should have gone to seek authorization for bombing another country.
America doesn't need to get authorization to start a war anymore. Barack Obama doesn't need to get Congress to sign off on invading people and committing mass murder no more. It's all good, as long as his basketball team wins in the Final Four.
Well, that's about the, craziness of it. The Libyan TV presenter, he might look crazy, but so does the U.S. going to war while they're president.
I don't like that answer. I don't like that answer. I'm reloading.
But speaking of wars, there is a war in the monetary world, and that is silver and gold versus the US dollar and all the other fiat currencies. So, you take a look at the silver chart here, and it's, of course, taking up arms, heading straight up. That's really attractive, Max. But, who is it taking up arms against? Who is silver taking up arms against? But this next headline, Max. Special report, the revolution in central banking. On a warm Lisbon day last May, Jean-Claude Trichet, the ice-cool president of the European Central Bank, was asked whether the bank would consider buying Eurozone government bonds in the open market. He said at the time, "I would say we did not discuss this option." Well, 4 days later, the ECB announced that it would start buying bonds. So just as lunatic as all these wars being declared on a weekend when Congress isn't sitting, nobody knows any war is being declared, the same craziness has gone on with the central banks. They have a revolution in central banking.
Well, I don't know if you saw the news. Let me just break out of the thing here. Did you see what is going on with the Bank of Japan on that front?
No. What's going on?
You didn't see that. Bank of Japan said that they're just going to start to issue bonds essentially and float money directly from the...
Oh, we talked about that the last episode, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so this is just another continuation of central banks going crazy and taking the law into their own hands and deciding just to print funny fiat money without any authorization. As you point out, if Barack Obama can simply invade a country with no authorization, central banks are using the same model here. They're just saying, oh, we can just print trillions of dollars or trillions of euros or trillions of yen. We don't need anyone authorization. We don't need any collateral. We don't need any accounting. We don't need any oversight. We don't need anything in the central bank other than the toxic waste that we inherited during the last financial crisis. Why? Because we use mathematical formulas that some pimply-faced 15-year-old kid at MIT says makes this $1 trillion worth of worthless garbage worth something other than worthless garbage. Guess what? It is worthless garbage. And that's why silver's going to 500, because you're all freaking delusional.
The article points out by reaching for its nuclear option, the ECB also helped rewrite the manual of modern central banking, calling it a revolution. But I would say that, in fact, it's skipped the revolution part and just gone straight to the reign of terror. These are what central banks are doing. It's a reign of terror that they are raining down upon us.
Well, they think they can reinvent the entire idea of economics from scratch because they're deeply in debt, and they are reinterpreting the fact that they're in debt and they're calling it something else. It's delusional. It's the Stockholm Syndrome en masse. It's highly illegal, according to any dictates that would cover counterfeiting. What these banks are doing, these central banks are doing, are counterfeiting. They're counterfeiting by the trillions and trillions, and they're doing it electronically.
Well, then the article finally wraps up. Since the early days of the financial crisis in 2008, the European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England have all been forced to adopt policies. It's kind of like the human shield thing. We're just human shields for this whole crazy monetary and fiscal disaster and economic disasters around the world that just a few years ago they would have dismissed as preposterous.
Right, exactly. They use this term force,
Yeah.
as if somebody has got a gun to their head and saying, you must commit fraud on behalf of everyone who supposedly you're protecting over there at the central bank. And that's false, of course. They're not being forced by anyone to commit fraud. They're doing so for one simple reason. They're making a boatload of money doing it because they're essentially pirates of the digital age. These are the pirates of the digital Caribbean age. You've got Bernanke and Trichet and the Bank of Japan who are just out there stealing. They're just out there larsonistically pilfering without any recourse whatsoever. And that's why silver's going to 500. Did I say that yet?
Well, yes, you have. But this is also preposterous in the way that the Norman Bates syndrome is. Just as the U.S. is fighting itself in Libya, it's fighting itself in Afghanistan, it's fighting itself in Iraq, all of the enemies there that they themselves created. The central bank is fighting itself. It's forced to fight itself. So it's in a battle with its own consequences of its own actions.
Well, that's the definition of quantitative easing, is actually eating your own defecation. You know, the central banks defecate out bonds and then they swallow those bonds back.
Yeah.
That's what quantitative easing is. It's quantitative defecation swallowing.
On the notion of preposterous, Chavez says capitalism may have ended life on Mars. This is Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, and he was speaking last week, and he said, "I've always heard that it would not be strange that there had been civilization on Mars, but maybe capitalism arrived there, imperialism arrived, and finished off the planet. So be careful," he continued. "Here on planet Earth, where hundreds of years ago or less there were great forests, now there are deserts. Where there were rivers, there are deserts," he said, sipping a glass of water.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think he's making kind of an interesting insight there in terms of capitalism being unsustainable. You certainly see it in the Fukushima Fichikuchi meltdown in Japan. That's a direct result of capitalism gone crazy. It no longer has any self-serving purposes. It's just using humans as the product of a mission to make profits out of dead people. And you see this happening in all over the world. So he has a point there. But you can't criticize the U.S. for being capitalist, because it's not. It's socialist. It's a bunch of banks and corporations who get huge welfare and bailouts from a corrupt Federal Reserve Bank. That's not capitalism. That's socialism.
Well, I don't think it's socialism. I don't think it's capitalism. Those are just isms. They're just like a religious text or whatever. It's the crazy madmen who have hijacked it. They don't realize they're Norman Bates. Here we talked about the European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England fighting themselves. They're forced to fight this demon of this crazy markets collapsing that they themselves caused.
Yeah, the Norman Bates syndrome. You remember Norman Bates in the Psycho? He saw his reflection in the mirror and couldn't understand that he himself was attacking and doing all the violence. That's exactly right. You've got all these central bankers looking at themselves in the mirror, printing trillions of dollars and wondering why the economies are exploding and going bad.
Well, it was actually Norman Bates' mother that he thought he was talking.
Well, those are the particulars, but I remember the title of the film was Psycho. And I think that's a good description of who's running the show here, a bunch of psychos.
Life on Mars may have ended apparently due to these psychos. And this takes me to the next headline. It might not be so preposterous. Maybe they're perhaps listening to Hugo Chavez. Sales of Lux Doomsday Bunkers up 1,000%.
Got mine.
Well, apparently it's a big market in the U.S.
Are you going to be, I can invite you into my Lux
Under this
Doomsday
desk,
Bunker.
that's old news. That's the 1950s.
Duck and cover.
Those don't work. So there's two different things. You could buy your own exclusive one, and those cost up to $20 million. So Northwest Shelter Systems, which offers shelters ranging in price range from $200,000 to $20 million, they've seen their sales surge by 70% on the uprisings in the Middle East. And then there's this other company, and you see that in the photo. This is one of their renderings of what one of their places look like. They sell rooms in 200-person doomsday bunkers. And they've received thousands of applications since the uprisings and the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And you have to deposit $5,000 and then pay up to tens of thousands more to actually secure a place in these bunkers.
Yeah, the timeshares in doomsday bunkers. And of course, the people who buy these doomsday bunkers for $20 million say, you see, capitalism works. I was able to buy a doomsday bunker. Forget about the fact that your actions created the doomsday to begin with. Why? Because you're psycho. Why? Because your imagination is the sound of your own one hand clapping against yourself. Because basically, inherently, when you look down underneath the substrata, substrata of the varicose veins, diseased mind, inoperability of your consciousness on any plane that would adhere to anything be construed as normal, you're pathologically ill. Ben Bernanke, Lloyd Blankfein, Ben Bernanke, Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon. Psychologically ill, brain damaged, treated in a straitjacket, carted off to jail, medicated heavily. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it. Stay right there because there's much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to turn to Issa Bloomy. He's the assistant professor of modern Middle East and Islamic world history at Georgia State University, and he's the author of Chaos in Yemen, Societal Collapse and the New Authoritarianism. Issa, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Great to be here.
All right, Issa Bloomy, while all eyes are on Libya, what is happening in Yemen, and why is it happening in Yemen?
The situation in Yemen is a direct response to ongoing processes of power grabbing and realigning of power alliances in Yemen. It's in part a response to what's going on in the south of Yemen, a traditional struggle between northern and southern Yemenis, but also the consequence of, since year 2000, the Saudi Arabia and Yemen have come to an agreement to police jointly their shared frontier, which has caused considerable disruption for the people who live on both sides of this border. Traditionally, this border has remained open. People were able to travel back and forth without passports. And now suddenly, since 2000, very expensive project, over $3 billion, the price tag as of now, is to police the border to the extent where they stop the trade and stop the movement of human beings back and forth, or at least regulate it to a certain extent. And that has disrupted people's lives. And people respond to these kinds of disruptions and challenges. And this has actually suited Abdul Saleh's regime very well, because he can then sell this disruption, this police actions that he has to take in order to enforce the sovereignty of Yemen and protect Saudi Arabia from the invasion of Yemenis trying to enter into Saudi territory, and sell this to his partners both in Saudi Arabia and the United States.
All right, so just give us some geography here. Where is this wall, and where is this? Who does it separate exactly?
If you were to look at a map of Southwest Arabia, you'll see that Saudi Arabia and Yemen share obviously a very long border, and it's the border that stems from the Red Sea inwards. And this is an area that was captured by Saudi Arabia in the 1930s, but they, under agreement with the people who lived on both sides of this border, that they really didn't enforce the border. So people on both sides were able to travel back and forth. So if you look at, it's an area called Najd. It's called Asir, the region, and these people are historically Yemeni. And as the Saudi kingdom expanded territorially to conquer Mecca, Medina, Jeddah, and then further south here in this region called Asir, because they had no means of actually physically intimidating and conquering this region, they basically left the border wide open for people to conduct their day-to-day life back and forth. So the border didn't really exist. Unfortunately, with the world transforming as it has in the last 15 years, policing borders, ironically enough, while Europe is supposedly tearing down borders, other parts of the world are being encouraged to build fences and police their borders. And that causes considerable economic, social, cultural disruptions in places like the Asir. And so, again, people whose lives were disrupted by this, and often a very brutal process of policing these frontiers has led to a reaction from people who are well armed and who are still dignified enough to stand up to tyranny. And that's certainly the case in Yemen. People are not going to take any crap from dictators and from people who sit in faraway places and start to play these kind of shell games, aligned with, of course, the United States or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who use Yemen as a kind of launching pad for all kinds of geostrategic calculations, which, of course, have direct impact on the people on the ground who have just had enough with it.
All right, let's talk about the comparison to 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, I think looking back, what a lot of historians are coming to the conclusion that the Soviet Union effectively economically was spent. And of course now, in the case of Yemen, Saudi Arabia, you couldn't say that about Saudi Arabia. It's not an economy that's spent. As a matter of fact, it's a very strong economy. That's a whatever you would like to call it, a petrocracy or something of that order. It's got huge oil reserves. So they're very well funded. So that dynamic is missing. So the Yemenis, in their quest to push back against this occupation, I guess you could call it, are fighting. They're up against a very well-funded foe in this sense. So talk to me about the chances of this going forward. What are we going to see in the next year or two? Is Yemen going to succeed as we've seen? I think we could say that what we've seen in Tunisia is a success. We're going to have to wait to see how it all works out. But is that going to be the story for Yemen a year from now?
I'm afraid not. And actually, I would step back and be a little bit more cautious in characterizing any of these events in the Middle East for the last couple of months as success cases. Certainly, we have the figureheads removed, but have we actually had the infrastructure of oppressive regimes and the oligarchies who run these societies actually been removed? And that's an open question still. I think people in places like Tunisia and Egypt are still willing to go and hit the streets when necessary. But it doesn't take much to intimidate a good percentage of those people who have been on the streets so far. In Yemen, it's a different case because people are very desperate, And I would suggest Saudi Arabia is also not immune from social unrest. The money is not distributed fairly, and there is a lot of regionalism in Saudi Arabia. And case in point was this area around on the border with Yemen. People have been are demanding, of course, not only payments in this kind of classic rentier state system where oil money trickles down to everybody and everyone just sits and watches TV, kind of like the U.S. model, I guess, where you just get fat and stupid and don't do anything. That they actually want some kind of participation and have a direct place in the decisions made in their societies, because they see their societies are falling apart. Okay. Yemen, it will in 1 year, 2 years. I don't see things changing. The Americans and the Saudis just will not countenance the transformation of Yemen in the way that they had in the past. Yemen in the early 90s, the same dictator who's now the chief ally of the United States played a hand where he was an ally of Saddam Hussein when they invaded Kuwait. And he was severely punished by that. Yemen was punished by that. 1.5 million people were thrown out of their jobs in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia and thrown back to Yemen, which is one of the kind of dynamics that led to this chaos, this turn towards chaos. This is my thesis, that Abdul Salah has used violence and used this disorder in order to position himself as the too big to fail regime kind of calculation.
Let me ask you this. When Barack Obama took office, he took a trip to Cairo and spoke to the region and seemed to tell everybody, hey, America's behind you. Get up and seek your freedom. And then when the people did what he suggested, he's very ambivalent. I think it would be a nice way to characterize his reaction so far to what's going on. And what more revealing, I think, is what we're seeing is how the geopolitics work out here. Barack Obama appears, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he appears to be completely aligned with Saudi Arabia and couldn't care less about these populist uprisings across the region.
Absolutely right. They stabbed everybody in the back. All these kids, very brave kids, that stand up to the regimes. And there's a story untold, in fact, that all these media who go and visit Cairo or go now watching from afar what's happening in Libya, people forget that the uprisings in Tunisia and Cairo produced lots of prisoners. Kids who are now in military prisons in Egypt, nobody is speaking on their behalf. Nobody is actually even interested what has happened to them. And this is my fear, is that we've all kind of bought into this nonsense that social networking has produced suddenly democratic subjects in the Middle East, and they can deal with it on their own, and that we have to now wait and see whether or not there are going to be fundamentalist elements in that, and therefore I think the Barack Obama message, which is kind of an ongoing attempt by the United States stakeholders in the larger American empire project, have lost all credibility. And that's, for me, for America, if I were sitting in Washington, D.C. and actually was concerned about the future of the military-industrial complex, I would be concerned about this, because there's only so much you can do by using a bludgeon of a dictator puppet regime, or indeed using your unmanned drones to take out opponents. At some point, as we see, people can, by the hundreds of thousands, show up on the street and change things overnight. Now, whether or not overnight means long-term change, obviously in the Middle East, as I feel, has not seen that yet. But there's always the potential. And no one anymore believes America as its friend. No one actually trusts America for actually taking the right side on this question, this divide between democracy and tyranny.
Let me ask you a final question here. Should the world, let's talk about this. It appears as though the U.S. is actually now just openly invading countries. They're invading East Libya. They're taking control of the sweet crude in East Libya. And they're just on an imperial conquest, it seems. Is this just another front in the ongoing Project Empire that America is attempting to finance with a completely non-respected U.S. dollar expansion?
Libya is one of those classic cases where they hedge their bets on the survival of their dictator of choice. And what has happened after a month of allowing Gaddafi to reinforce his army with professional mercenaries and to bludgeon those who dared to stand up to him is now this intervention is to assure that the 2.5 million Libyans who can never return to living under Muammar Gaddafi will be contained kind of like in a concentration camp in eastern Libya around Benghazi, an area that has never really supported Gaddafi in the first place. It's always been a headache for Gaddafi. So I think even the idea of leaving that part as a kind of autonomous free zone, something like South Sudan or something like that, would be to the advantage of Gaddafi in the long run. I have no doubts that this has, been a managed crisis, and they've done quite well. They've saved the regime that has proved to be a very lucrative trading partner for many countries in Europe and the United States, for sure. At the same time, they contain their potential refugee problem. There's nothing worse for politicians in Spain and Italy and Greece than to have a bunch of North Africans flooding the border. So I think they've accomplished a lot by waiting it out until Gaddafi was in the suburbs of Benghazi, and now they're doing this farcical intervention, which will not lead to regime change. And it will lead to basically creating a new divided Libya.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Issa Bloomy, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure. Buy silver.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Issa Bloomy. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.